Hello, and welcome to this lecture on the Speranskii reforms and Kenesary's revolt. All of you, I'm sure, have heard of Kenesary. You'll probably be familiar with the statue of him that stands outside the Turfan restaurant, which is the picture on the opening slide. You may not be so familiar with the Speranskii reforms, but you will find that the two topics are actually quite closely related, and I hope that in the course of this lecture it will become clear why that is. So I'm going to start with a map. I realise this is rather confusing, it's extremely detailed, but I'd ask you to look carefully at the northern part of the steppe. First of all, you'll see a heavy brown line. This is the line of Russian fortifications. It had been there since the early 18th century. We're now in the early 19th century. And during that time, it hasn't really moved significantly. Up until about the 1820s, the real effective limits of Russian power and Russian control run more or less along that line. So the Orenburg line, the Ural line, the Irtish line, and so on. But you'll see to the south of that heavy line a series of dotted brown lines, each of them centered on a different, what's now a different town in northern Kazakhstan. And these are so-called prikazi. They are new administrative centers established by the Russians in the northern steppe, mainly on the territory of the Ortajuz in the course of the 1820s. One of those, as you'll see, is the Akmolinsk prikaz, which was established in 1824, and which, of course, is the origin of the modern city of Astana. And you'll see further to the south a sort of a green circle with arrows coming out of it, which represents the territory, the core territory controlled by Kenesary during his resistance to Russian expansion, together with various raids which he carried out on Russian administrative centers and also on Kazakhs under Russian rule. Further to the south of the steppe, it gets very confusing, but I want you to focus in particular on the Khanate of Kokand. You'll see there it's centered on the Fergana Valley. That was its political core, but by the early 19th century, its power extended quite far into the steppe. It extended into the Sirdarya Valley up towards Akmazjid, which is modern Kizilorda, and it extended into most of Semirichi. So at the beginning of the 19th century then, the Dashti Kipchak, the Kazakh steppe, was bounded to the south by three sedentary states. The Emirate of Bukhara, which was ruled by the Uzbek Mangit dynasty and had been since the 1740s, the Khanate of Kokand, which I've just referred to, also ruled by an Uzbek tribal dynasty, the Ming dynasty, and finally the Khanate of Khiva, ruled by the Uzbek Kongrat dynasty since 1806. Now, none of these rulers were Chinggisids. The Ming and the Kongrat dynasties claimed that they were Chinggisids, but actually they weren't. They represented a new form of political legitimacy which came out of the Uzbek tribal elites in this region. Khiva and Kokand in particular were quite heavily involved in steppe politics. And again, if we return to the map very quickly, you'll see why. Their territory borders on territory occupied by nomads. Bukhara is a little bit more cut off from them. Both of them have territorial ambitions in the Sirdarya Valley in particular. And they have relations with the Kazakhs, unsurprisingly. So in 1805, Yunus Khoja, who had been the ruler of Tashkent, which before then was more or less an independent city-state, died, and Alim Khan, the then ruler of Kokand, captured the city. In 1809, he sent his newly appointed Hakim, that is his governor, who was a Kazakh called Sarem Saktura, to conquer Turkestan. I just want to pause for a moment to emphasize that although Kokand had an Uzbek ruling dynasty, we shouldn't think of it as an Uzbek state. So it had a very mixed population, it had a very mixed ruling elite. Apart from Uzbeks, many Tajiks from mountain areas served Kokand, particularly military capacities, and a great many Kyrgyz and Kazakhs also attained court titles at Kokand and played a very important role in the governance of the Khanate. So there's nothing surprising about the fact that the first governor of Tashkent appointed by the Kokandis was in fact a Kazakh, in this case this Salim Saktura. Now Alim Khan's brother and successor, Ulmar Khan, used his Ghalcha, that is his Tajik mountain troops, to capture more towns and forts in the Sirdarya valley, culminating with the foundation of Akmazjid, as I say, of Kizlorda, by one of these characters whose name was Lashkar Kushbegi in 1834. And Khiva, meanwhile, had founded a fortress called Jankala in the Sirdarya in the 1830s, bringing several Kazakh lineages, the Chikli, the Tabin, Totkarin, Bayuli, under its control. So this is an overview of Kokandi territory in the 1830s. And you can see Kokand controlled, its center was the city of Kokand in the Fergana Valley, as the name of the title suggests, but they controlled Khujand, Tashkent, Chimkent, Turkestan, Akmazjid, and they also controlled, at least nominally, most of the territory, which is now northern Kyrgyzstan and southeastern Kazakhstan. So what were they doing on the steppe? Why were they expanding? Khiva and Kokand were partly motivated by a desire for revenue. So both states were levying zakat, that is the traditional Islamic tax on commercial transactions, on the sale of livestock in the steppe. They also wanted to be able to control trade routes to Russia. These were of growing economic importance in this period. And they met only quite sporadic resistance from the Kazakhs in this region, many of whom, as I've said, were served with or allied with the two Khanates, and who at this time were politically disunited. The expansion of Khiva and Kokand into the steppe was also facilitated by Russia's preoccupation with the war against Napoleon until 1815, with their Caucasus frontier, and with relations with Qajar Iran and Ottoman Turkey thereafter. By the 1830s, however, the Russians are turning their attention to the steppe once again, and they were not happy about Kokandi and Khivan interference, as they thought of it, with Kazakhs whom they claimed as their subjects. They thought of this as an affront, as something which questioned or insulted their sovereignty. So there's no unified Kazakh response to these Russian and Kokandi encroachments on the steppe from the north and south. We have some Kazakhs who serve Kokand, some of them who serve Khiva. Some voluntarily moved to Russian territory to form the Bukay Horde on the other side of the Ural, the Yaik River. Others played a vital role in the organization of the Russian expedition to Khiva, which took place in 1839-1840. But the Russians would encounter significant resistance from at least one Kazakh leader, Sultan Kenesary Kasimov, or Kenesary as Kasim Oghlu. Now, Kenesary was a grandson of Ablai Khan, as I'm sure you all know, and he claimed first the Khanship of the Middle Horde, the Ortajuz, and then that of the Kazakhs as a whole. And his movements at the time, and in a lot of Soviet historiography, was described as a rebellion of Ostania by the Russians. It's described in a lot of early Soviet and modern Kazakh historiography as a nationalno-освободительное движение, a national liberation movement. Now, in my view, neither of these descriptions is really very accurate. So Kenesary was not a Russian subject, and the territory he claimed was not under Russian sovereignty in any meaningful sense, so his movement can hardly be described as a rebellion. At the same time, given that many Kazakhs refused to recognize his authority or fought with the Russians against him, his movement was also not national in the modern sense. So, just a reminder, here's that map again. I hope it makes a little bit more sense to you now. A growing Russian presence in the north, Khiva and above all Kokand encroaching on the steppe to the south, and there in the middle we have the territory which, for a while at least, Kenesary is able to control in the middle of the steppe. Now, I'm going to step back a little bit at this point to talk about a concept which I suppose is a little bit more, not theoretical exactly, but which helps us to frame or to understand the relationship which the Russians have with the Kazakhs and above all with Kazakh elites in this period. And it's one that I would characterize as indirect rule. This is a term which we take from the historiography of the British Empire and above all of British India. So in India, the British often placed local rulers, Maharajas or Nawabs or other Indian princes, in subsidiary alliances rather than annexing their territory directly. They controlled them through a resident at court, often taking a portion of the tax revenues as a sort of payment for their protection. And the French did a very similar thing in Tunisia and in Morocco. In Central Asia, the Russians would later, once they conquered the southern part of Central Asia, they would turn the Khanate of Khiva and the Emirate of Bukhara into protectorates. Now, in the early 19th century, the Russians used Kazakh Khans and Sultans in a very similar way. They would provide them with titles and symbols of rule, such as seals of office, and the best example of this was that of the Bukay Horde near Astrakhan. So if you look at the image on this slide, you will see here we have a Kyrgyz, that is a Kazakh sultan, or Khan rather, with his wife. He's wearing a Kazakh hat, but you'll see that his kaftan or his sort of uniform coat, while to some extent it looks like a traditional chapan, it has Russian epaulets on it, and I think that this symbolizes quite well the kind of relationship we're talking about here. Now, that's the relationship which obtains in the late 18th and the early 19th century. The Russians, insofar as they control the steppe at all, are ruling indirectly through Kazakh elites. It starts to change from the 1820s onwards. So in the case of the Bukay Horde, Bukay Khan dies in 1817. He is succeeded by Sanjahangir. But after his death in 1845, there are no more Khans for the Bukay Horde, though it survived as an administrative unit till 1852. No new Khans of the junior Zhuz were appointed after Sher Ghazi Khan died in 1824, and 1822 saw the abolition of the Khanship of the Orta Zhuz, the Middle Zhuz, which had been based in Petropavlovsk. Now, the Chinggisid nobility still played an important role in Russian administration, but increasingly they were much more firmly subordinated to the control of Russian officials. And this is taking place as part of a set of reforms which bear the name of Mikhail Speranskii. So here we get to the Speranskii reforms of the title of the lecture. So as part of a wider set of administrative reforms in Western Siberia, in 1822, Mikhail Speranskii, who is an important Russian statesman of this period, introduced a new set of regulations for the Siberian Kyrgyz. So this is part of a wider set of legislation called the Ustav об управлении инородцев. This formalizes the status of Kazakhs as Russian subjects, or inorodцы, and creates a formal administrative structure of inner and outer okrugs and a hierarchy of rule under Chinggisid sultans. The basic unit of administration that this creates for Kazakhs is the aul. These were grouped into volosts under a Chinggisid sultan, and then in turn into larger districts under a starshi sultan, who was also a Chinggisid, who held Russian military rank and who could attain noble status. Now, the Ustav creates administrative divisions, and it also attempts at least to create a legal structure for the Kazakhs under Russian rule. So it doesn't say it doesn't say much explicitly about the role of customary law, or adat, and the B, that is the traditional judge, although it clearly envisages a role for them beneath the new administrative and judicial structures that it had created. In practice, actually, not much seems to have changed in the practice of customary law before the 1860s. So at that level, Bs in the steppe are still implementing basically Kazakh customary law without a great deal of Russian interference. However, where the Speranskii reforms really do make a difference is as an attempt to regulate or to limit the mobility of Kazakhs. Okay, so I hope this slide is not too confusing for you, that it will give you an idea of the how the Russians sort of organized this territorially. So the idea is that you have both alini. So this is the sort of the old fortified frontier line. And then beyond that, you have the granitsa. And the granitsa is a sort of vaguer demarcation of Russian control in the steppes. The inner districts are called blizlinenie. Those are the ones that are closest to the fortified line. And then you have the border districts, pogranichnie, which are those which are somewhat sort of further out. And the Russians are attempting to regulate movement between these two lines. Obviously, for nomads, that's a very big deal. Nomadism is about nothing if it's not about movement. So this attempt to restrict movement, and indeed not just between across the frontier line, but between different okrugs. This is something that's also sort of built into the wording of the Ustav. Is a very serious matter for Kazakhs. Although the question to which the degree to which the Russians are actually able to enforce this is perhaps questionable. And as part of this, they create a whole series of okrugs. Now, these are the dotted brown lines that you saw on that earlier map. Karkarali, Kokshetau, Ayaguz, Akmola, Bayanaul, Uchbulak, Amankaragay. Akmolinsk, of course, is another one. And you can see here some estimated numbers for the population. The Russians measured the population in terms of the number of yurts per aul per volost, with an assumption about the number of people per yurt, so it's not completely accurate. But they're starting to collect statistics on the people who are living under their control, at least nominally. So the Okruzhny Prikaz, which is the main administrative center in the steppe, has an administrative structure made up of 2 Russians, 2 elected Kazakhs, 1 Starshi Sultan, and sometimes a local Cossack commander. The next level down is the Volost level, where you have a Volost Sultan. These are generally hereditary. And then at the level of the aul, you have the Starshina, or elder. Now, the Starshi Sultan, in principle, is meant to be of Chinggisid descent. The wording in the Ustav is he's Roda Sultanov. He also has a rank as a Russian officer, a chinovnik, and after 9 years of service, he can receive a Russian title of nobility. The Volos Sultan must also be of Chinggisid descent, is hereditary, and is a Russian officer. So we see here it's a kind of hybrid system. On the one hand, the Russians are still paying attention to the old forms of authority on the steppe, which derive from Chinggisid descent. At the same time, they're trying to incorporate them into a new administrative structure. So this is what's happening then in the territory of the Ortazhuz, and the Russians call the Kazakhs of the Ortazhuz the Siberian Kyrgyz. Now for the Orenburg Kyrgyz is the Kishijuz. This is what the Russians call them. The situation is quite similar. From the late 18th century, the Khanship of the Ortazhuz is basically in the hands of the Russians. They appoint them. From the early 19th century, more systematic efforts are being made to bring the Kazakhs into a recognized system of imperial administration. And in 1786, Baron Osip Eaglestrom, the then governor of Orenburg, establishes the Orenburgskaya Pogranichная Komissiya. This is an organ of joint administration for Kazakhs beyond the frontier line, which is headed by a Russian officer with 2 other Russian and 3 Kazakh representatives. This is an organ of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and it's only in the 1820s that it begins to extend its authority further into the steppe. So the equivalent of the Ustav o Sibirskich Kyrgyzach for the Orenburg Kyrgyz, for the Kishijuz, is the Мнение об Orenburgskich Kyrgyzach, which establishes an administrative hierarchy that's not exactly the same, but quite similar. You have the Orenburg Governor General and you have the Border Commission, which have joint authority over 3 Sultan Pravitels, so-called, one for the western, one for the center, one for the east. The Border Commission does include some Kazakh representatives. You have the same distinction between Blizlinyenie, the inner Kazakhs, those who live closer to the frontier line, and the steppe Kazakhs, at least until 1831. And after 1831, the Russians start organizing distanci. So these are the equivalent, really, of the okrugs that you have in the Siberian side, which are administrative centers out in the steppe. And each distancia commander then has a certain number of starshinas underneath his authority. After 1839, that system expands. By the mid-century, you've got 54 different distanci, each of them divided into местности, or auls. So that looks very, very complicated, but the main thing you have to remember is that this attempt to regulate Kazakhs beyond the line led to the establishment of new Russian fortresses much deeper into the steppe. Okay, so you'll all be familiar with this conventional story that the Kazakhs become Russian subjects, when Abulkhair makes his submission in the 1730s, and you'll already have heard how this is a far more complicated story. It doesn't actually happen when they say it does. It's really at this period, the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, that the Russians are starting to actually extend their military power, extend their administrative power out into the steppe and really control the lives of Kazakhs, try to sort of regulate their movement, trying to collect taxes from them. And they're doing this by means of fortresses. So these include Atbasar, Kokshetau, Karkarolinsk, Akmolinsk, all founded in 1824 as the centers of outer okrugs. They then add more at Prikazit Ayaguz and at Kokbektin. And this permanent Russian presence in the steppe, which is something new, would provoke significant Kazakh resistance over the next 2 decades. So here we have the map again, just to remind you. I hope it makes even more sense to you now. All those dotted lines up in the steppe, all those new sort of centers that are being created, all of these represent a new presence for Russian power in the steppe, a presence which Kenesary will resist. Okay. So I'm going to give you a couple of chronological slides for Kenesary. In 1837, he sort of first bursts on the Russian consciousness, at least when he attacks the fortress at Aktau. In 1838, he sets fire to the Pristavstva at Akmola. And in 1839 to 40, he starts to gain more and more control of the Sirdaria trade route. In 1841, he's recognized as Khan by a good number of clans, mainly, although not exclusively, from the Ortajuz. And there are various things that conspire to make Kenesary's initial bid for power and resistance to Russia successful. The Kokand Khanate is weakened internally by a Kyrgyz Kipchak rebellion, which overthrows its ruler. And in 1839, the failure of the Russian expedition against Khiva has shown the logistical limits of Russian military power through the steppe. Between 1842 and 1845, Kenesary really reaches the acme of his power, and he makes further incursions into the Sirdaria Valley and against Kokand. In 1845, he does begin negotiating with Russia, and the military initiative starts to slip away from him. In 1846, he and his followers move southeast. They attack the Kyrgyz, who, as you may gather, have a rather different view of Kenesary to that which prevails amongst Kazakhs by and large, and in 1847 he is killed by them. We know a lot about Kenesary. Most of it comes from the letters he wrote to the Russians, and it's possible you'll be reading some of those as sources for this class. We also, of course, have accounts of him in Kazakh epic poetry, and indeed in Kyrgyz epic poetry and oral narratives. So this is a quotation actually from one of these Kyrgyz narratives. It's recorded 50 years later, but purports at least to be recalling what Kenesary said when he came and sort of appealed to the Kyrgyz to join him. The Russians are a numerous people who crush enemies that oppose them. They have become like a rising flood crossing the Idil, that is the Volga, and the Yaik, the Ural rivers, and the Ural mountains, taking over the innumerably teeming Kazakhs of the Sariarka. Their divisions are the toughest, and their soldiers are exceedingly numerous. From the beginning, in foreign and military affairs, we Kyrgyz and Kazakhs have for the most part shared equally in our blessings, good and bad, and in our prosperity. We are a mingled people in a material as well as in a spiritual sense. Let us prepare to make war together. If we Kazakh and Kyrgyz unite, then Tashkent, Kokand, and Samarkand will not be able to avoid our power for long. If you do not unite with us, a large force will come. Well, the Kyrgyz didn't unite with Kenesary, and perhaps they had good reasons for not doing so. But he was certainly right about the Russians spreading further across the steppe. So what is Kenesary up to then? If it's not a national liberation movement, and I really don't think it is, what he really seems to be trying to do is to recreate, almost the last attempt to create a nomadic confederation in the steppe. In other words, to engage in what we might describe as state building. Okay, so just as the Dzungars created a nomadic confederation that was a formidable military power, which often controlled now being sedentary regions, just as the Kazakhs themselves had done this in an earlier period, Kenesary is seeking to do this in the middle of in the early 19th century. So his core support comes from clans who are of the Ordo Jews and beyond, who are disgruntled by Russian policies. Especially they're angry because of the construction of fortresses on their territory, growing taxation, erosion of Sultan prestige, often also Kokandi expansion, because Kenesary does fight against Kokand as well. And Kenesary has many different sources of legitimacy. He's a Chinggisid, but of course he's also a grandson of Ablai, and this is something that features very prominently in his correspondence. He often refers to this. Rhetorically, at least, he draws on Islamic precedent as well. He talks about Islam. And he attempts to gain recognition among the Kazakhs, but also from Russia and from the Kyrgyz. And this, I think, is also something that's very important. What Kenesary wants more than anything else is recognition of his title as Khan. This is something I will return to shortly. Where does he get his income from? Taxation, but also tribute, extortion, and pillage. I mean, there's no doubt Kenesary does attack his fellow Kazakhs quite regularly and raid their flocks and herds. What forms of rule does he use? Well, some of these are imported from more successful neighbours, so systemizing taxation, ushur, which is an Islamic tax of 10% of the value of the harvest. Some reliance on firearms, which he obtains partially with Bukhara and sometimes with heathen help. Also, he's definitely exploiting the residual nomadic advantage. He wouldn't be able to defeat the Russians in a pitched battle, but he's very good at avoiding them. And this is something that the Russians are always complaining about. You find it over and over again in their reports. The structure of his forces is quite sort of regular, modern if you like, and he pays a lot of attention to logistics, and in particular to control of the grain supply. So what are his aims? Well, he wants recognition of his title of Khan. He wants to resist Russian expansion. He wants access to pastures, and in some cases he's also pursuing feuds with neighbouring Kazakh clans. And the evidence that we have for this, as I say, mainly comes from Russian archival sources. So, for instance, in October 1843, the Bees of the Chumkiev lineage asked the Russians for protection against Kenesary, saying he had carried off 4,000 sheep and that they would provide horses for a Russian expedition against him. In the same month, Sultan Sapali Murзалиев wrote that все расположенные в тех местах киргизы сожалеют, что русские отряды, выходившие в степь, ничего не сделали и опасаются, что после этого им доведется больше прежнего переносить грабежей и других разорений. This is not an unusual sort of sentiment. You get a lot of letters from sultans sort of saying that Kenesary is planning to attack them. And the Kyrgyz view of Kenesary is certainly not very positive either, as we've already discussed in part. This comes from a wonderful Kyrgyz epic poem called The Story of Kenesary, edited and translated by Daniel Pryor, in which we read, Ablai Khan's descendants always harassed us. Just look at the evil done by Ablai's descendant, Kenin. Kenin Khan's mind turned evil, and he came out scheming to eradicate the Kyrgyz. No few have heard of this. He antagonized the Muslims so badly that he quite resembled an infidel. Kenin Khan assembled his troops from the place called Saryarka, from the Argin and Naiman peoples, from every place he could. Then he set off towards the Kyrgyz by way of Kurdai Pass with an army of about 1,500 to plunder the Kyrgyz, to wreak formidable slaughter upon them, and to carry off as booty their livestock, their goods, and their orphans. Well, if you read the poem, you'll know that that isn't what actually happens. He and his Nauruzbai end up being defeated by the three naked heroes. Of course, the Kazakh epic poems about Kenesary and Nauruzbai are quite different, and this emphasizes an important point, which is that we get different views of Kenesary depending on which kinds of sources we look at. It's not that the Kyrgyz view of Kenesary is necessarily right, but equally, it's not that we can simply take the heroic image of him we find in Kazakh epic poetry as being the gospel truth either. One of the things that helps Kenesary to sort of survive as long as he does is that the sort of Russian attempts to suppress his rebellion or his resistance to them are divided between two different commands, so Siberia and Orenburg. And during the late 1830s, early 1840s, the leaders of those two commands, P.D. Gorchakov, who's governor of Western Siberia, and Vasily Alexeyevich Perovsky, governor of Orenburg, hate each other and are constantly finding ways to sort of needle each other. So if we look at this letter here from Perovsky to Gorchakov, he writes, многолетние опыты доказали бесполезность усилий войск Сибирского корпуса в Киргизской степи против мятежника Кенесари. С одной стороны, трудности степных поисков, и с другой, удобность, представляющаяся казахам избегать преследования воинских отрядов, достаточно оправдывает безуспешность подобных предприятий. Не менее того, шайка мятежного султана но снова возрождалась, иногда в превосходнейшем против прежнего числе, и в будущем мало представляюсь надежды прекращению этих беспорядков. Экспедиция против Кенесари, не нанося собственного ему значительного вреда, давали повод наказания целых казацких родов и тем усиливали только в этом народе ненависть к России. So, Perovsky hints there at the fact that the expeditions sent against Kenesary are often very brutal, that they actually punish the innocent, if you like, and that this is generating resistance to Russia. But the broader point he's making here is that the Siberian forces are quite useless. And of course, the Orenburg forces were no more effective, actually, in suppressing Kenesary or catching him. If we look at this letter, which is a translation of one of the letters that he sent to General Gorchakov, we start to get a sense of what it was that Kenesary was actually after, at least from the Russians. And again, this is quite a typical letter, although it comes from a later period when his power was already sort of starting to slip away from him. So, причем сообщаем, что мы с времен дедов и отцов наших никогда не уклонялись от милостей государя-императора и не производили беспорядков, но впоследствии, видя, что измерями земли, на коих мы имели летние наши кочевки, предполагаю заложить на них крепости, мы встретили беспокойство и не могли иметь пребывания на них, но этой самой причине мы принуждены были обратиться с просьбой к здешнему начальству. Но если вы теперь умилосердись и исходатайствуете нам Улутау, Сарису и Чекенгур, Дойланчик Тургая, то мы готовы принять клятвенное обещание и сдержать оно, в каком бы то роде предложено не было, чтобы никогда не вооружаться против народа подвластного государю-императору. So this is quite a conciliatory letter from somebody who is supposedly a bitter foe of the Russian presence in the steppe. He does refer to the fact that fortresses are one of the main grievances, the occupation of territory, the occupation of summer pastures, these are things that he would like to see removed. But at the same time, he's offering his loyalty. He's saying that he was driven to rebel against the Tsar, if the Russians would only agree, they could come to a modus vivendi if they could agree to divide territory, which I think tells us something important about what Kenesary is actually after here. It's not so much driving the Russians out of the steppe altogether. What he wants is a better political relationship with them, at least from his point of view. In fact, a revival of the kind of political relationship that had existed at the time of his grandfather Ablai, which he often refers to in his correspondence. Namely, that the Russians would recognize his position as Khan, extend their patronage to him, but basically leave him to his own devices, ruling in the steppe. By the 1830s and 1840s, that's not a possibility. The Russians have abolished the title of Khan of the Ortazhus. They're bent on a much more direct form of administration. They're not interested in working with Kenesary. So what are the longer-term effects of the revolt? Kenesary was killed in 1847, but his power had already waned by that point. And if we understand his revolt as an attempt to revive the authority of his grandfather, Ablai, which I think we should see it that way, and recreate a nomadic steppe confederation, then it ended in failure. The nomadic advantage that he used had all but disappeared. Now, some historians, and notably Bekmakhanov, have argued that Kenesary's resistance helped to delay the Russian advance into Central Asia by 20 years. Now, this assumes that there were factors other than prestige and military security driving the Russians to expand in Central Asia, and in my view, this wasn't the case. Instead, in fact, the need to suppress Kenesary was used as an excuse for building fortresses much deeper in the steppe than ever before. So what we see then is that in 1845, the Russians build two new fortresses, one at Turgai, one at Irgiz, and then in 1847, they build another one at Raim on the Aral Sea. So by the late 1840s, they've penetrated far deeper into the steppe than ever before. They're at the in the lower part of the Sirdarya Valley. They're about to enter into an open clash, in fact, with the Kokand Khanate. So there's really no sort of let-up in the rate of Russian expansion. So what's Kenesary's legacy then? Well, he was never recognized as Khan by all the Kazakhs, nor did he manage to unite them all against Russia. But he was remembered long afterwards as the main leader of resistance to Russia. An important tradition of oral poetry kept his memory alive, and so Bekmakhanov argued, and I think this is a reasonable argument, provided the main evidence for the widespread impact of his movement. The very fact that Kenesary became such a prominent figure in the poetic tradition suggests that he was important. And this is a quotation, we cannot take that which is ours, we cannot now in great expanse camp in our own fields. A high-handed enemy has gripped us all round in a tight vice. O men, we are all cursed, cursed by our unhappy life. Like free deer we went to drink from the clear spring, like the wild horse we grazed on the plains, and now we again are hemmed in by the enemy. O my deserted people, you have lost your power and your peace. O people, we find ourselves in the most dire misery. How then can the people be strong, dragging their lives without a Khan? In the Soviet period, there was quite an extensive debate about the national nature of the revolt, which led to eventually to its classification as reactionary feudal and the banning of Bekmakhanov's book. Some of you may have seen the film that came out a couple of years ago called Amanat, which is about this controversy, and it's quite well worth seeing. It's interesting. And today, of course, the revolt plays a very important part in the modern Kazakh national narrative. But I don't think we should allow that narrative to obscure the much more complex picture which emerges when we actually look at the sources from the time. And we see that Kenesary's resistance to Russia is also tempered by a desire for recognition from Russia, a desire, however, that would not be fulfilled because the Russians were bent upon a much more direct, much more bureaucratic control of the steppe with which Khanship, the kind of Khanship that Kenesary aspired to, was not compatible.